It's that time again. We're going to read from Ruth chapter 2, and I do want to read the whole of the chapter again. Again, because it's not too long, but also because we've been missing out on some of the story if we didn't read it all. So if you want to turn there, go ahead. Otherwise, it will be up on the screen, and you can follow along there. Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who was kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter." Boaz went over and said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I am only a foreigner." "Yes, I know," Boaz replied, "but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." "I hope I continue to please you, sir," she replied. "You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers." At mealtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine." So she ate with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time." So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz." "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our close relatives, one of the family redeemers." Then Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him." So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. Wow. Okay, we've moved a long way from the end of chapter 1 last week, haven't we? Well, let's talk about that this morning. Patience is a virtue, right? We get told that from the time that we're little. Patience is a virtue. We try to instill it in our children. Our parents do everything they can to beat it into us, and yet we resist that notion, don't we, often? Patience is a virtue. At least we try to live that way, and we talk about wanting to live that way. We talk about trying to pray for patience and to cultivate patience in our life. It's a fruit of the Spirit. Patience is something we should want, right? But then whenever you look around at people, I'm not sure that there's a lot of evidence that people are actually working on patience. Does anybody else get that feeling? Myself included, right? I say that I want to work on patience. It's a fruit of the Spirit. I should want it. But I'm not really sure that I'm doing everything I can or that I should to truly cultivate patience in my life. We say we want patience up until the moments when we actually really need patience, right? Because in those moments, it's all of a sudden, can you please stop praying for patience? Come on, God, can we just get through this moment already? I'm tired of dealing with the same thing over and over again. But patience isn't really the end-all, be-all of life that sometimes we make it out to be. There absolutely are moments when patience is not only required, but fundamental to bringing out the best in who we are. And yet, there are moments when patience isn't what's required at all. When maybe we think it's patience, but instead it's action. I think Ruth exhibits one of those moments here in the story, and I want to come back to that here in a moment when I touch on her in particular, but she could have been patient, right? She could have sat back and said, God, I know that you will supply me supernaturally with the grain that Naomi and I need to survive. But she didn't do that, did she? So we're going to look at that in a moment. I want to start out by talking about the laws on display in this chapter. So, a couple months ago, we went through the 10 Commandments. And those are really kind of the heart of the whole, 600 and some odd commandments that we find in the Old Testament. Those 10 really sum up what the Lord is trying to communicate to his people. But I want to look at the laws specifically that are in action in this story. The first one to talk about is one that Dan actually touched on this morning during his communion talk. And that law is found, I use the Leviticus 19 passage, but it does come up in Leviticus 23 as well, and actually in Deuteronomy 24, in case you're interested in going to look those up. But if you'll turn to Leviticus 19, that's where I want to go look at this law. It is the law that allows foreigners, that allows the needy, the poor, those who are downcast in the Israelite society, whoever they may be, to gather food. It's an important law for the people. Look at 19:9, starting in verse 9. When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with your grape crop. Do not strip every last branch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the grapes that fall to the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. Then look at verse 11 as well. Do not steal. Do not deceive or cheat anyone. A couple of things to notice from this law. First, notice how the poor and the needy are welcome to take food that they seemingly have no, quote, rights, unquote, to. Right? At least that's how we think of it. We think of it in terms of rights all the time. This is my stuff. That's your stuff. That's how we talk about things all the time. Notice the poor have access to somebody else's stuff. Sometimes that sets us a bit on edge. No, I worked hard. I planted that field. Nobody else should have any right to come in and take what is lawfully and rightfully mine. And God declares, well, guess what? It's not lawfully yours. In fact, God says, I am the one who gave you fields to take from that you never planted. I'm the one who brought you to a land that had houses already built that you had nothing to do with. So the truth is, none of this is yours anyway. I think that's a healthy perspective that we need to keep about life. This isn't my stuff. This isn't our stuff. It is God's. We simply tend to it in the meantime until it all fully becomes His again in His kingdom. That's the picture that God is giving the Israelites. These fields aren't yours. So when somebody comes along who needs food, you let them take it, because that's the right and honorable thing to do. The second thing to notice about this is what happens in verse 11. The commandment to not steal and to not deceive or cheat anyone follows immediately after this law about letting people pick up grain, people who are in need. I think the connection here couldn't be any clearer. To refuse to allow a poor or needy person to do this, to live by this law, is to be stealing from them. It is to deceive and to cheat those who are already poor and needy. I think the connection is very apparent. And so when these things don't happen, if Ruth had not been allowed to go out and to pick grain, to go do what she was lawfully allowed to do, then by law, those field owners would have been stealing from her. They would have been cheating her out of what she lawfully had access to. The second law that I want to discuss is that of it gets translated a lot of ways. If you were reading along in your Bible with me, it gets translated as kinsman redeemer, as near kinsman, as a near relative. There are lots of different ways to translate the word that is given in Hebrew. And all of them kind of touch on the same thing. But with regard to this specific story in mind about Ruth, Boaz is going to be acting as somebody who takes over the responsibility for the family land. So when God gave the Israelites the land, he also told them, make sure that the land that is part of your tribe stays within your tribe. So if somebody is from the tribe of Dan, and they marry a woman from another tribe, Zebulun or something like that, the land by law cannot pass to Zebulun. It has to stay within the tribe of Dan. And the purpose there was, I think from God's point of view, that you each have your areas. Don't encroach on your fellow tribe, your fellow people's area. Stay within the boundaries that he has set for you. That's what Boaz has the right to, or almost has the right to. In fact, there's a nearer relative, right, that we're going to find out about, in case you've read ahead already, that we're going to find out about coming next chapter. There is actually a nearer relative. But Boaz, by this law, has the right to keep this property that Naomi and Elimelech owned, to keep it within the family. He is supposed to do that. And we actually see that law in Leviticus 25, in case you're interested in going to look there. But this gets played out in another story as well, in Jeremiah 32. And I'd like you to turn there, if you will. This is a really interesting story in Jeremiah 32, beginning in verse 6. And we're not going to read it all, but so Jeremiah has been prophesying, hey, you're going to go off into exile. You're going to be there for 80 years. That's what he's been telling the people. And God says, because the people don't believe him, lo and behold, look at that, the Israelites don't believe the prophets. I know it's a big surprise to all of you. But they didn't believe Jeremiah. And so the Lord had Jeremiah perform a sign act. His cousin comes to him and says, hey, I have this property that I need you to buy. And so Jeremiah does it, and the Lord tells him, the reason you're doing that is so that I can prove you will come back into the land. If Jeremiah owns property still in this land, then that's a sign to the people, no, good things are coming in the future. So let's look at the story in chapter 32 of Jeremiah, starting in verse 6. At that time the Lord sent me a message. He said, your cousin Hanamel, son of Shallum, will come and say to you, buy my field at Anathoth. By law, you have the right to buy it before it is offered to anyone else. And this is the same kind of thing we're seeing in Ruth, chapter 2. Then just as the Lord had said he would, my cousin Hanamel came and visited me in the prison. Oh yeah, I forgot that. Jeremiah is in prison at this time. He said, please buy my field at Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. By law, you have the right to buy it before it is offered to anyone else, so buy it for yourself. Then I knew that the message I had heard was from the Lord. So jump down to verse 13. Then I said to Baruch as they all listened, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says. Take both the sealed deed and the unsealed copy and put them into a pottery jar to preserve them for a long time. For this is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says. Someday people will again own property here in this land and will buy and sell houses and vineyards and fields. So it becomes a sign act. He performs this law as a sign act that they're going to get their land back. All right, flip back to Ruth chapter 2. Other than these couple of instances, we don't really see this law lived out anywhere else in the Bible. But it's interesting that it happens here. And these two instances show us how this law is supposed to work, right? They show us how the law is supposed to work. Though, again, we're not really sure if it worked this way all the time. We don't know whether they were living by it or not. But at least here, Boaz is trying to do what the Lord has asked of his people to do. And we're going to come back to Boaz in just a minute. The other thing I want to talk about with regard to the law is, in some ways, this is a little counter to what I was just talking about, how Boaz is living by the law. And yet here we see a bit of the lawless culture of the Israelites at this time. So as we read at the beginning of chapter 1 in Ruth, we know that Ruth's story is during the time of the judges. Now, stretch your imaginations back and let's imagine the time of the judges. Was this a good time in the life of Israel? No. Was this a lawful time in the life of Israel? No. Was this a sinless time in the life of Israel? Of course, the answer is no, over and over and over again, right? As we see that cycle played out of religious idolatry, of just sinful behavior so much in the life of Israel. It seems to me that we see some of this lawlessness come out in the story as well. If you look back at verse 9, there's this small phrase that comes out right in the middle of it. I want to look back at that together. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. And then here, I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. That's what my translation, the New Living Translation, says. The NIV, for some of you who have that, says it this way: I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. The King James says, have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And the Net Bible says, I will tell the men to leave you alone. We could debate about which translation is actually, quote unquote, correct. I think they're all hitting on the same thing. I'm not really interested in the fact that the translations say something minutely different, though. So that might surprise some of you, since I am a word person. But I'm not interested in that this morning. What I'm interested in, frankly, and deeply concerned by, actually, is the underlying issue that's actually prompting Boaz to feel like he needs to say this to her at all. Why would Boaz need to assure her that if she works in his field and works alongside the other women working in his field, that she won't be roughed up by men? And I think, quite frankly, the way that we need to understand that is that we're probably talking about sexual being roughed up, at least physical, if not sexual. And I think the context of the story leads us there. It's really strange how this works out sometimes, because I've been planning on preaching through Ruth for about 8 or 9 months. I've had this planned out when I wanted to go through Ruth. At the time, I didn't know what conversation was going to be going on nationally last week in our society. I had no idea that we would have, a Supreme Court nominee being accused of sexual misconduct in his past. But here, these things, they line up perfectly. I can't help but talk about our own culture, which to me seems to fit the culture of Israel in this moment. And that is that I heard things said this week, setting aside whether Judge Kavanaugh did those things or not. I personally am not interested in that this morning, right? I'm not a litigator. I don't know whether somebody is guilty or not. But what we did see, or what I did see, were Christian people, prominent Christian people, saying things like, well, boys will be boys. Or a man shouldn't be held responsible for something that he did as a teenager, or something that he did 30 years ago. Again, whether Kavanaugh did those things or not is not important to me. What is important to me is that we have Christians essentially being okay with the kind of culture that we see going on here in ancient Israel. That bothers me, that deeply disturbs me to the core. That we would be in line with that kind of thinking. Why would Boaz have needed to reassure Ruth that she wouldn't be harassed? Does that not bother you that says something about their culture? And that we explain away the same kinds of situations in our own society? Again, I don't know what kind of harassment it was, but I think the implication is clear that it's sexual. Boaz is afraid that if Ruth doesn't stay with his other female workers, that someone is going to to molest her. And it certainly wouldn't be the only instance we see of that in the Old Testament, right? So the story isn't out of place in that regard. But what a terrible place for a society to be, right? That women who are simply doing the things that they're allowed to do would be in danger of being harassed, physically, emotionally, sexually, however. And again, I think our society in some ways is not much different at times. Who are we going to be as Christians when it comes to situations like these? Are we going to stand with those who are hurt, or are we going to push them aside? The idea that boys will be boys or that men shouldn't be held responsible for what happened when they were teenagers, those statements aren't just false. They're not just wrong. They are deeply disturbing, and they display the very worst of who we can be as people, instead of striving for the very best that we can be. Boaz is absolutely to be commended for his protection of Ruth, okay? We're going to talk about him in a moment, but I want to hit on that now. He is absolutely to be commended for his protection of Ruth. He sees an issue in their society, and he says, I want to work against that, and here's a way for me to do that. I love that. But it's unfortunate that the women were in danger at all. As Christians, we have to do a better job at advocating for and creating a culture that honors all people and seeks to protect anyone who might be in danger of harm. And that's what I see in Boaz. Israel was failing at that time during the time of the judges. We know that. Let's not do the same thing. Let's not be the same kind of people. All right, let's talk about Ruth and Naomi. Let's give an update on where they are because we talked about them last week. So what happened with them in chapter 2? Well, I think what we see clearly from Ruth is that her character shines. I want to highlight that character from this chapter. And I began my sermon today by talking about this idea of patience and how Ruth doesn't just, well, maybe she has patience, but in this moment, she's unwilling to just sit back and do nothing. Her character shines forth because she's going to go work and provide for herself and for Naomi. Ruth chose to make something happen. And we talked a few weeks ago about Moses. He's standing with the people before the Red Sea. Remember, and the people are crying out, Moses, help us. And he says, just wait. Just have patience. Let's wait on the Lord. So Moses prays to God, and God says, what? What are you waiting around for? Get up and do something, right? I love how Ruth's character shows us that she's unwilling just to wait around. She gets up and she does. She continues to shine in spite of the story telling us over and over again, I don't know if you noticed this in chapter 2, how many times she's called a Moabite, or described as a foreigner. Over and over again in this chapter, it's just being drilled into us. Ruth shouldn't be getting anywhere in this society, but she is because of her character. Her character is so strong, and she's such a good worker that even an Israelite foreman in Boaz's field praises her to Boaz. That says something about her. I don't think there's any chance that we're meant to believe that Ruth just happened to find herself in Boaz's field. I think we are absolutely meant to recognize that God's hand is at work. God is driving the events of this story. We see him all throughout it. And so Ruth shines in a time when she surely must have been in somewhat of an identity crisis, I would think. Right? She's a foreigner trying to fit in on foreign soil. She's a widow trying to simply eat and live in a society that mostly men are working, right? She's a daughter-in-law with no husband. And so she's not even by law or blood related to the woman with whom she's living. She's a woman trying to provide for her family. What an identity crisis to be going through. And yet she pushes through and she perseveres, and her character shines in this moment. And then let's talk about Naomi. Naomi remains timid, I think. There are different ways to, see the character of Naomi in this chapter, but I think she remains timid. At the end of chapter 1, we saw how bitter Naomi was, right? She was saying of the Lord, it's your fault. You have done these things to me. And as we begin chapter 2, I can only assume that she's in somewhat of a similar emotional and spiritual state, because we don't get any reason why she doesn't go out into the fields and work with Ruth. I mean, why doesn't she do that? Maybe she felt like she was too old. Maybe she couldn't hack it anymore, right? Ruth's the younger woman. She's able-bodied and able to do that. Maybe that's it. Perhaps she was feeling too sad, too emotionally depressed to get out of bed. There are people who suffer with that, right? Maybe that's what Naomi was going through. Maybe hopelessness in God had so set in that she just didn't care anymore about what was happening. Perhaps she was waiting on Boaz or the other close relative that we're going to read about next week. Maybe she was waiting on one of them to step up. Maybe they, by custom, were supposed to approach her and say, I would like to buy this field from you and have you be part of my family now. I don't know. Maybe she was patiently waiting around for one of them and they were failing to do their part. We don't really get the reason for why Naomi is sitting back and letting Ruth do the work, but we do see Ruth shine forth in this moment, right? What we know by the end of chapter 2, though, is that Naomi has gone from a woman in despair at the end of chapter 1 to a woman praising God at the end of chapter 2. That's a huge difference in her life in just this one chapter. Naomi is realizing that God has not abandoned her in her suffering. While she is not fully over her hurt, this is a significant step for Naomi to take. And we're going to see that process continue through the story. And the situation for Ruth and Naomi, therefore, has dramatically shifted in just one chapter. We're in a completely different place now. No longer are these two women devoid of hope and feeling like foreigners. Finally, they're beginning to find their home in this land. Okay, so let's talk about Boaz, our new character in the story for this week. Who is Boaz? Well, here's what we know about Boaz. We know he's a somewhat wealthy and prestigious individual who lives in or near Bethlehem. He's described as a strong or a great man. It's some kind of leader in the community, essentially. He's of some relation to Elimelech. We don't know exactly what, cousin, second cousin, third, who knows for sure. But he's of some relation to Elimelech and therefore by marriage to Naomi. And so we know that by law, Boaz has some kind of rights, at least that he could claim to Elimelech's and Naomi's property. That's what we know about Boaz, right? And given these details about Boaz's wealth and familial relationship to our protagonists in the story, to Elimelech and Naomi, I wondered, why didn't Boaz help his family during the time of the famine? If Boaz is so wealthy and has so much stuff, so much food, where was he? Why did Elimelech and Naomi have to leave town? Why did they have to flee to Moab in this time? I think there are a few potential answers to that. Maybe you could come up with more, but these are the ones that I thought about. Perhaps Boaz himself was also suffering greatly during the time of the famine and just couldn't spare anything. That's certainly a possibility. Perhaps Boaz is a very generous person, but he had closer relatives that he needed to take care of as well. And so there just wasn't enough to go around. If Elimelech was some kind of, a little more distant relative to him, maybe Boaz just didn't have quite enough to share with everybody that needed to be taken care of. Perhaps Elimelech and Naomi were just stubborn, and they refused the help. Maybe Boaz offered that help. Maybe Boaz went directly to Elimelech and said, "You are my family. I want to provide for you. Here's some grain." And they, "Nah, I don't want handouts, right? I'm not going to accept any help from my family. I can do it on my own." Maybe that was something Elimelech said. We don't know for sure, right? Ultimately, we know who's behind them moving to Moab. God, right? Ultimately, this is the outcome that God needed. This is the outcome that God needed to push his plan forward to bless all the peoples of the world. Because it's through Ruth that David comes. And then it's through David that Jesus comes. And it's through Jesus that everybody on earth has access to reconciliation with God. So this is the outcome God needed. And therefore, this is the way the story played out. But I wonder what other things might have been going on. We'll never know, but I'm just curious. It's one of those nagging questions as I was thinking about it this week. So what does he do in this story? We know who he is. What does he do in this chapter? he does a few things that I want to highlight, and we'll end here. I've already talked about one of them, but I want to emphasize it again in connection with Boaz. He arranges for Ruth to be protected while she gleans. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing. I think we're also meant to assume that the other women gleaning in his field, that he's also taking care of them. That he is also putting this kind of cloak of protection over them so that they are all provided for and protected while they're gleaning in his field. This is the sign of a great man. Make no mistake about that. This is a sign of a great man. He's truly living up to the way that God is intending for his people to live. Beyond just providing protection, though, Boaz responds incredibly generously to Ruth. Now, as Dan pointed out, it's not really a generous thing for Boaz to say to Ruth, yeah, come along and pick where you're lawfully allowed to pick anyway. That's just him following the law, right? But he goes above and beyond that. He invites her to have a meal with him during the midday. And did you notice what it says there? She doesn't just have something to eat. She eats all she wants, and then she has some left over. Boaz gives her the right, not just to pick, but to also drink from his well. Again, not a small thing. He doesn't have to do that. He's providing generously to her in a way that he doesn't have to. Through his actions, Boaz expresses his concern not just for Ruth, but also for Naomi. We see that in the story as well. And he knows that there is a relative closer in relationship to them. That doesn't matter. I mean, Boaz could have said, hey, go talk to the closer relative. I don't have to deal with you. You're not technically my responsibility, so why don't you go talk to him about this? He doesn't do that. Boaz allows for his own crops, his own water to be taken so that these people can be fed and taken care of. I think his example is such a good one in this story. We often talk about people in the Bible and their character flaws, right? And how God uses them in spite of their character flaws. That's not the case with Boaz. He's somebody that we can look at and not have to excuse character flaws like we do with David and Solomon and, Abraham and Isaac and all these other characters from the Bible that we go, yeah, they're great people, but you remember that one time that such as, we don't have to do that with Boaz. Boaz is one of those people that you can go read about and go, that's a good guy. I like that. I really like Boaz a lot. And I love what happens through the rest of the story as we're going to see the next couple of weeks. And what's funny is just reading chapter 2, did anybody else find themselves already beginning to root for Ruth and Boaz? Like, yeah, come on, get together, Like we want to turn this into an immediate love story. Like, yeah, it's this very serendipitous moment. Woohoo! Okay, just me. Good. Yeah. I love where the story's going. Chapter 3 and 4 give us even more good stuff coming out. I want to conclude today with just a few things. And Ruth teaches us a lot by her character and her work ethic, right? We talked about that. So one of the questions that I had is, are you always waiting on God? Or are you seizing the moments you need to as well and taking action? Sometimes I think we can get caught up in that patience game. I'm just going to be patient and wait on the Lord. I'm all for that. I'm all for having patience, and I'm all for waiting on the Lord. I also think there are moments where we need to step out on faith and do things. I thought about the story of Peter. Jesus is walking on the water, Things are really choppy. Jesus is walking out to the boat on the water. And what happens? Everybody else is afraid, and what does Peter say? God, I want to come out to you. Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come out. And Jesus says, okay, come on out. What does Peter do? He goes. The rest of them are willing to just wait patiently for Jesus to come to them. Peter is willing to go. Now, he has a lack of faith in that moment, right? But initially, I think his intention is really good. And sometimes we need to seize those moments too and not just wait patiently on the Lord to solve everything for us, right? To clear up what's going on. Naomi, as we see in chapter 2, slowly begins to find hope again. One of the questions I had is, how long does it take for you to stop blaming God for your circumstances? That's a tough one, right? Because it's a very easy thing to do, to just say, well, it's God's fault. If God had given me better parents, or if God had given me a sibling that actually cares about me, or if God had, had worked through my husband better, or had X or Y, whatever we say. How long does it take for us to get over blaming God for our circumstances? Naomi seemingly has worked them out pretty quickly, although we don't know exactly how long, the story's gone on between these two chapters. But it's something we need to consider. The last thing, do you have a heart like Boaz's for people to help? I love his heart and how it's he just cares about people. He cares about people being taken care of. He cares about people being protected, even if it comes at a great personal cost to him. Even if it means giving up his clean water. Even if it means taking food off of his table. He's willing to help people. That's the kind of people we need to be. As Christians, are we going to use Boaz as an example of somebody that we need to be like? There's a lot of good from this story. There are probably things that, as you read, you thought about that I didn't even touch on. That's good. Tell me about those. I want to hear what those were, because I seize on different things than you do sometimes, and I love to hear those things. I love to know what caught your attention in this story. I hope you're excited to continue to go through this story, because I think there's so much good here to learn from. This morning, we're going to have a time where we stand and sing, where we offer you a chance to, if you need prayers, we want to surround you and pray for you as we did earlier, standing around. It's not just a visual representation. That's who we want to be. We want to be a body of people looking at each other, facing each other, and saying, I got your back. I'm here for you. That's what we can do this morning as well, surround you and pray. If it's through baptism, we want to rejoice with you as you go into the waters. So if you have any of those needs, please let them be known as we stand and sing.